Hi, Matthew. Welcome to Module 2 Training Zones Science, Simplicity, and Effectiveness. What do we got for this module?
Yeah, so this one that has actually been pretty popular. This has been one of our most popular podcast episodes. I think because no one really talks about training zone science and kind of what they're used for.
There's a lot of hearsay and, bro science that gets passed around about zones. And there are so many different ways to measure zones. It's how do they all apply? What do they mean? What's the underlying science behind them? And so we're going to break all of that down, really, so you understand zones to their full effect.
So here's what we're going to do today. So we always do this thing called the 5 W's, and we're going to do the 5 W's of training zones. That's how we're going to start off. And then we're going to go back and review the energy systems. We talked about them in the last module. We're going to talk about them again because there's a lot going on with energy systems. So there's the threshold. You might think of the FTP, critical power. There's about a zillion thresholds that you could be using. We're going to talk about what that actually means for you and what it means, what's happening inside of the body and how we use that information. We'll go over some files, and we're just going to start to introduce how we analyze files. And we'll get into that and talk about zones within those rods. We can do zones a few different ways. We have a few different methods, and we're going to break those down and talk about the differences between them. Then we have our takeaways and a link to a podcast. Okay, so Will, what are training zones to you?
For me, I use them really two ways, like setting, training intensity, and then like post analysis. So monitoring like either training or race effort, like time and zones, that kind of thing.
So it's like a numerical guide, like as a way to guide your training, right?
That's exactly it. Like we're talking language, right? So we want to be talking the same language wherever we are in the world. Like if we're working with athletes on the other, in a different continent and different nation, we can say zone 1 and we want it to mean the same thing. And they can say I rode or ran in zone 1 and I know what they mean and they know what I mean.
Yeah, so that's why we have them, right? So who uses them?
Well, I wouldn't say that's the only reason we have them. Like we also have them for the specifics of intensity, so representation of intensity. And well, I think everyone should use them.
Yeah. So coaches and athletes. So I can say to you, I spent all day in zone 1. And you'll know exactly what I mean immediately because you know what zone 1 represents, right?
Yeah, you were on the couch.
Yeah, no. That'd be, I don't even know if there's a zone for that. That's just rest, right? Because zone 1 is actually, it's okay, right? It's okay to spend time in zone 1.
It is.
Active recovery. So I guess the way we use it, we can use it for language between us, and then you and I as coaches and scientists can use it as language between us and our athletes.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
When do we use them? For me, we pretty much use zones all the time. So if I prescribe a workout, I say, here it is, zone 1 to zone 2, standard endurance day. That's where we spend most of our time training in endurance zone. So I use it when we're prescribing training, when I'm talking with athletes, like, did you stay within the zone? And then when we're analyzing the rides as well and your runs. So all the time, actually, right? Anytime we're talking about training, we're talking about zones.
It's always zone. It's always zone representative.
Yeah, so that means they're pretty much relevant everywhere since they're relevant all the time, right? This is the basis of what we do, is zones. And then
regardless of sport.
Yep. Yeah, so actually, the zone 2 in cycling is pretty similar to zone 2 in running, isn't it?
Whoa. Yeah, it has the same number after the word zone.
Yeah, so the whole point is that we're expecting the same demands, similar demands, at least as far as energy systems go on the body. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and that's right. So like that's where the language can be conveyed similarly across any kind of sport. So like a triathlete obviously undertakes 3 sports and they can convey that same meaning of zone 2 pretty much directly associated with aerobic development, as we discussed in module 1, and they can just apply that to all of their 3 sports. And whether they're measuring heart rate, running pace, obviously you're not going to measure running pace in the pool or on the bike, but you can use it to measure zone 2, and you can use power on the bike, which you're not going to use in swimming, to measure zone 2. So it's always zone 2. The way we measure it is going to be a little different. but it's going to represent the same thing. That is zone 2, and then that is aerobic development. And even as an athlete, you don't need to necessarily need to know that aerobic development side of thing. That's for your coach, and maybe even for them, it's for one of their associates.
And then we'll talk about so we have our 6W that we always have in the podcast, right? It's not even a W, it's an H. So we're going to talk about how we set training zones. There's a zillion ways to do it. We're going to talk about why we use what we use. So just as a refresher, and we need to talk about energy systems because that's pretty much what training zones are representing. So Will, do you want to give us a quick overview of what you talked about with energy systems?
Yeah, so we've got the phosphagen system, the anaerobic energy system, and the aerobic system. And they all have sort of their time thresholds, I guess, to use that word threshold again. The phosphagen system, or PCR, phosphocreatine system, is like, it's super short, 10 seconds or less, 100-meter sprint. It's really just a matter of getting the energy as quick as possible, hopefully before the other energy systems are able to catch up, because there is going to be a delay. The start of a race, you don't have enough oxygen. Hopefully you've warmed up, but you potentially don't have enough oxygen to be able to provide the energy that is required to get off the start line, especially in something like a triathlon swim start or a mountain bike start. But we get through to going along the right of the graph, the anaerobic system, and that's, we're looking at 1 to 2 minutes max for the maximal contribution of an anaerobic system. And then we get through to the aerobic system, the bread and butter of endurance sports. And then we're able to use zones to try and train these specific systems, the crossover points of these systems, and help to develop a full holistic endurance athlete. So that's really how we're using the energy systems in relation to zones.
Yeah, so it's pretty predictable for the people that invented zones and us as coaches, scientists, to understand that when we prescribe exercise within a certain zones, that what's happening in that intensity realm is that we're giving the demands on the body to these certain energy systems. So we know that if we're going easy for 5 hours, we're probably stressing the aerobic system almost completely. So we're not getting much of a contribution as far as energy goes from the PCR system unless we're sprinting within that 5 hours. But we know that, well, since that energy system only lasts about 10 seconds, there's not going to be a huge contribution within that 5-hour ride from the PCR system, even if we do 110-second sprints. And that's because that energy system takes a really long time to recover. So when we're prescribing training and we say zone 2, zone 1, zone 5, we know where the demands are coming from. And we'll get into that as we go through this module.
Yeah, and really, it's just kind of the agreed science, which we need to understand when we start to overlay zones into these energy systems. We want to go, okay, look, this is the way the body works, and this is the way we're able to convert oxygen and our food sources into usable forms of energy. And these are the approximate times that represent these energy systems, and also there are crossover points. So it's not a hard science, like in terms of, at 10 seconds, the PCR system will completely stop. But there are the predominance of those energy systems, and we just need to understand that so that when we apply zones over top of that, we all know what those zones are trying to achieve and what they represent, like metabolically.
Exactly. And I sometimes think about the poor postdoc or whatever that created training zones, because they're so precise, right? 87% of your threshold is the upper end of this zone. And what we know, there probably were thousands of participants in these studies that were designed to make these zones. And there would have been some outliers, right? So the zones aren't perfect for everyone. But as we know, they're great guidelines, and that's why we stick with them.
Speaking of poor postdoc students, what about this guy?
Yes. So we all know the functional threshold power, FTP, and cyclists are going to use this. Do you guys use this in running, FTP?
Critical power.
Okay. So we'll talk about how those are so related soon. But when I first started my career in science, I was thinking, what does FTP mean? The steady state. So the way we measure FTP is we go out and we do a 20-minute time trial or an 8-minute time trial. We go as hard as we can and we take the average power throughout that test and we multiply it by 0.95 or 0.9, and then we get something that represents our lactate threshold pretty much, and then we use that to set our zones. And we're using this to gauge our ability, right? I was looking
Yeah,
at this.
like pacing, especially, and zones,
Yep,
as we'll get
zones,
into.
zones, and as a benchmark, right? So what mountain bikers and everyone like runners will do, you'll say, well, did my critical power improve? Yeah, my critical power improved, so that means I'm a better athlete. And I was thinking about this for mountain biking. I was like, there's no way that this actually means anything. This functional threshold power means anything for mountain biking, because mountain biking is so off and on. You go hard, then you go easy. You go hard, and then you go easy for hours, right? I was like, there's no way the steady state power means anything for mountain biking. So what we did is we got real tricky, and we had, I think it was a dozen mountain bikers do FTP tests. And then we randomized it, proper science here. I was going around to people's houses doing proper science in their basements. And then what we did is we developed this intermittent power test. And this was 45 seconds as hard as you could go and 15 seconds rest for 20 minutes. It was horrible. And
Sounds
I thought,
horrible.
maybe we should do it sometime. Right?
I'd rather not.
But I thought, yes, this definitely represents mountain biking from all the power files we analyzed. I thought this is going to make way more sense. So if we try and predict how fast someone goes around a mountain bike track, because it's so off and on, this intermittent power test is going to predict time way better. And it turned out, like, unfortunately, it was only a little bit better at predicting how fast the mountain bikers would go. But the reason for that is because this aerobic level of fitness is so important for even intermittent sports. So even though it was a little bit better, we could predict time a little bit better with the intermittent power test. The intermittent power test and the FTP levels were so related to each other that they were almost the exact same thing. So if you had a really high FTP, you were also really good at doing intermittent power. And that's when I started to realize how important aerobic fitness was. And this FTP, representing the upper limit of the aerobic fitness, that's when I realized, okay, well, this is the real deal. And this is why we stick with it.
That's exactly right. So if we move on to setting training zones, we can get very caught up in the 20-minute, the 5K run, the 10K run, the 400, 200 meter CSS swim time trials. But in actual fact, like Matt showed in his study, there's an underlying fundamental, as we showed in that crossover continuum of the energy system graph, that we're just trying to get a threshold, and there are so many ways you can go about it. What are some of the ways you use, Matt?
We've tried actually all of these. So we've had people in the lab so many times, right? Measuring oxygen uptake, and then we're trying to see where the oxygen uptake breaks, and they start taking in more and producing more CO2, and there's the RER, and then we're looking at ways to measure the gas exchange threshold using some a V-slope method, and just really complicated methods. And
actually,
power,
on that, I don't know how many VO2 max tests I've done. At least a couple hundred. I've probably done about 50 myself. I've got more useful data out of real world testing, like a 5K running time trial, than I have out of hardcore scientific analysis on an athlete.
I don't think lab data is the most important thing. And even when we did have access to using the lab at the university, I would still get my athletes to just do a field test, because we just were more interested in their power, and we didn't have to always look at what they were doing, what their muscles were using as fuel all the time, because we knew pretty much what was happening by looking at how their power was. So if I start working with an athlete tomorrow, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to do a field test. And the reason that's useful is because, firstly, what I can do is with that field test is I can say what their fitness is today, and we can use that to track as we go through the training. We expect them to get more fit, but we can also use that threshold test to set their training zone. So I can go to Training Peaks, set their zone, and automatically all the workouts populate themselves. And it makes it really simple for me as a coach to have the language with the athlete, and then we can get the ball rolling really simply.
Yeah, I use the same. And with running, especially trail running, a lot of zones just outside of heart rate just don't work. Kind of the default people look at is pace and running pace. But when you're running up a hill, the pace quickly blows out. And if you're trying too hard or you're trying too easy on the downhill, it doesn't work. And then unfortunately, somehow, some way back in the day, as we get into a module 3, with heart rate, it just became age-adjusted heart rate zones. And these are default. And sometimes people don't understand the heart rate-based calculation, so they may just leave it as default. And this can really skew the information, both if you're training 2 zones and you haven't changed them age-based, and also like if you're trying to analyze it and you're thinking, geez, this athlete is just thrashing themselves. So I always do some kind of heart rate threshold test, because man, the variance in heart rate I've seen across individuals, especially, I'll just give you an anecdote of a 50-year-old male runner that signed up, and he said, oh, I got to tell you, I run hot. And I was like, oh yeah, here we go. They all say that. They were like, oh, no, my heart rate's always high. It's like, yeah, because you're always training too hard. But anyway, so I set him off, gave him, it's a 20-minute hill climb we have here locally to run. Very hard, but it's an amazing way to get an accurate representation of their threshold heart rate, because it's not like a flat time trial. Some athletes are always going to be able to bang out a really good 5K day in, day out. They're just super consistent. Some people get very emotional about the word time trial, and so best effort is a term I prefer to use for a lot of these kind of tests. Set them up, and sure enough, 50-year-old individual close to 200 max heart rate with a sustainable average, it's about 25 minutes. He averaged at 187, and any age-based calculation suggests that that is impossible. And his zones were just completely different, almost 40 beats different at a zone 3. So that's where, having these tests, having them reproducible, is going to create a more accurate means of training and analyzing for the coach and athlete.
Yeah, and those time trials are really hard, right? Like, there are a lot of athletes, we get pushback sometimes, if we test too much, and rightfully so, because if you're going all out for 20 minutes, you're not starting all out, but you're doing an all out average effort, which is what we want to try and represent that lactate threshold. We get a lot of pushback, so we want to be really efficient with doing those time trials, because we don't want to have to do them all the time, right? So if we could pick a test that's efficient and use it to set zones and gauge fitness, that's great.
Yeah, because we're only really looking to find one thing, right? The threshold.
Yeah. So this is one of my most favorite graphs to show ever. So along the
it
axes,
looks confusing.
Well,
is that why you like to show it, just to prove that you're smart?
No. It to me, it describes the simplicity of training zones and the simplicity of the threshold, right? So there's all these different names that we can use to represent the threshold, but they're all kind of happening at about the same intensity. So if we go across the bottom, oxygen consumption. So we know a certain amount of oxygen. We need a certain amount of oxygen to do a certain amount of work. So this could easily be transferred at the bottom for power output along the bottom.
Or pace or swim speed.
Yes. So you can imagine, as your pace gets higher, your blood lactate concentration and your volume of expired gas increases. Your VO2 goes up, and that's what we'd expect as the work gets harder. So as you go harder, lactate starts to accumulate because you lose the buffering capacity, because there's just too much of it, because you're going too hard.
That's the yellow graph.
Yep. And at a certain point, the clearance, the accumulation exceeds the clearance, and it starts to build up. And that first point where it happens is called the point of lactate threshold. Lactate threshold, pretty much your FTP, right? And we go up a little bit more, and the blood lactate concentration can exceed 4 millimoles per liter, and that's called onset of blood lactate. And what you can see, and the important thing to note here, is they both happen around 3 liters per minute of oxygen uptake. And then if we go up to the next line, the red one, that's volume of expired gas. And you can see the ventilatory threshold there, the first one. It's happening about the same intensity of the lactate threshold. And the respiratory compensation point, which is happening about the same point as OBLA.
As a practical reference, I like to say respiratory compensation point is the point is where you can't hold a conversation comfortably. You're like, yeah, oh yeah, cool.
Yeah, so this is pretty much how every group exercise ends up about 20 minutes in, right?
Yeah, about top of zone 3, bottom of zone 4
Yeah.
on the easy bunch ride.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone's still going easy. They finish their easy ride with a bunch of Strava crowns. Right?
Yeah, and yeah, FTP increase notifications.
Yeah, exactly. So, I love this graph because it shows that all of these thresholds, even though we have lots of fancy words for them, they all represent the same point. So that's why it's really important for me to just pick one and stick with it.
Yeah, imagine if you'd figured this out before you went and did that study.
Like if I was actually interested in aerobic metabolism before I did that study, yeah, I probably wouldn't have gotten the publication because I wouldn't have done the research.
That's fair enough.
My first pro tip is, even though there's tons of different ways we can test, stick with one way to test. And the other beautiful thing about Training Peaks is that it keeps track of these different power peaks for us. So, for example, 5 seconds and 1 minute, we know 5 seconds is probably representing our PCR system. So, if we want to improve our ability there, we can track it just by looking at our 5-second power. We can test it specifically, or we can look at it in races. So, it's the same as we go across. So, as we get to 20 minutes, we know that that's starting to represent more aerobic ability. 60 minutes is definitely aerobic ability. So, I stick with the 20-minute test or a set benchmark test. Not every athlete has a good place to test for 20 minutes. So we find a test and stick with it. And then we look at what Training Peaks gives us for the power profile.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll use a chart like this. If we're in amongst a race season, you don't need to test all the time if an athlete's doing a race in which you can clearly see using this graph and these profiles that their power is improving, their fitness is improving. Maybe they're not doing as well in a race, but that could be a pacing related situation. But you can at least go, okay, I'm not going to thrash you over 20 minutes. I can see we're tracking in the right direction.
Yeah. Like if you already had your PB for 20 minutes last week, like you're not going to test it again. Like what's the point? Right.
Yeah. So like, well, what are the zones, Matt? Like what zones do you use? Do you use 1 to 10, 1 to 5?
Yeah,
1
I
to
use
7?
these. I use the Coggan training zones. So these are preset in Training Peaks. I just set the athlete's FTP within training zones, and then I apply the Coggan training zones. And I usually delete like zone 6. I usually use 5 or 6 zones, just because some of them are so narrow that it's almost not even applicable for setting training and analyzing training. So I stick with these. These Coggan ones work great for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I really only. Well, actually, do you want to show my zones? I
Yeah.
have a different way of depending on the, I guess, education base of an athlete. So I've got my emoji system. Like I want to incorporate all the information, and this is one that I've put together. Athletes are going to come into training and training zones a whole array of education levels. They're not all, signing up to a 6-part e-learning masterclass course on how to train effectively utilizing sports science.
But they should.
So I have this pretty basic chart. I was poo-pooing age-based heart rate zones before, but in terms of someone who's very new, wanting to take care of themselves and just doing an introduction, they do make for a very easy calculation. So I have used the Dr. Phil Maffetone's MAF, or maximal aerobic function formula here, which is just 180 minus your age. I have found that to be across the board pretty good for new athletes. Anyone who has been training a long time and is over the age of 40, especially females, haven't seen it to be that applicable. But again, if you're just getting into things that are at least going to keep you in zone 2 and stop you from thrashing yourselves. So what I've put with the emojis, like that's pretty simple for someone who, we all learn differently. If you learn by images, like emojis are pretty clear. We all understand. It's like the modern day hieroglyphics.
Yeah, it's like that guy in zone 3. Look at his cheeky grin there.
Yeah, like is this?
Like, yeah.
Hey, are you all right? Yeah, it's fine.
This is a little too hard.
Yeah, no, fine. So, and I made it a swervy line as well because, like the energy systems, it is a continuum. You don't want to be 1 heart rate beat or 1 second per kilometer over and be in zone 3 and think your training doesn't work anymore. So what I've got here is like I've got pitches, I've got RPE, I've got pace references, and obviously like a more metric form of heart rate. That's something that everyone has. And so you at least get a gauge of the intensity, the RPE, and like what it looks like. Then, yeah, we get into like the more sciencey, numerical, metric-based systems, and that's like the Coggin zones. So there's a lot of ways you got to pick your battles, pick who's actually looking at them, because if it's just about you analyzing it, just throw them some emojis, let them see what what they should be feeling as opposed, and then you can tell them later on that they were definitely training too hard.
There's an important thing to note here in that each zone has a lower limit. Did you know that?
Honestly, I'm definitely a culprit of training upper limit of every single zone.
Yeah, but you don't have to, right? Like training
No,
in
you
the middle
don't.
of the zone's
No.
okay.
Yeah, I'm actually quite surprised when I slow down because I'm a bit tired and I'm still in zone 2. I'm like, oh wow, this range, this zone is actually quite large.
Yeah, it's called a zone for a reason, right? It's not a like set limit or a set thing, right? It's a zone.
Yeah.
So if we go back, we need to start to bring these training zones into an energy system, because that is exactly what training is trying to do. Training is trying to stress an energy system so that way we can break it down and start to rebuild it as we go.
That's right. And with the stimulus, there is a response and an adaptation, and also rest
Right.
is required for this, which we all suck at as type A endurance athletes. But with these specific zones, we can then again look at those underlying energy systems and start to target them. And something like this image really helps convey what each zone is trying to do, because you can, your coach can tell you, or you can set them in training peaks, but you may forget, like, why am I making this athlete train so slow all the time? Why are they're complaining a lot? But it's a great way to sort of represent what you're actually trying to achieve and what happens in an Ironman, a marathon, like an endurance multi-stage mountain bike race, because we need to be effective and we need to be representative of the demands that we're going to undertake.
Exactly. And then you need to also, if you look at it that way, you also need to look at the flip side and say, okay, we're spending a lot of time in zone 5 training. Why are we doing that? Does that actually have anything to do with our event? So as Will talked about in the last module, aerobic fitness is number 1 pretty much all the time, unless you're Usain Bolt trying to sprint, right?
Yeah. He doesn't need to recover. He doesn't need to do intermittent sprints. It's just one effort every 4 years.
Yeah, I think he does a few more like scattered throughout there.
I guess he's got to qualify.
Yeah, so if we're an endurance athlete, say we're doing like an Ironman, why are we spending so much time in zone 5 stressing the ATP PCR system, right?
Right, and we can tell when an athlete has been doing this training, I don't want to necessarily say improperly, but not as prescribed, by analyzing the training with zones post-event, like post-race, post-training. So if we bring up a file, we can see there's going to be a huge array of different efforts and intensities inlaid with like one single effort. This is is this your race, Matt?
No, this is one of the athletes that I work with from a local championship race. And what I did is I overlaid their functional threshold power there, just to kind of give an idea of how the power output related to that functional threshold power.
Yeah, and because if we were looking predominantly, just at heart rate pretty much sits just high the whole entire time. And you'd think, this effort through heart rate was probably zone 4 to 5, which is understandable. But then if we want to look a bit deeper, and we'll get into this more in further modules, but just in terms of referencing with zones, we can have a look at the power, and it's just a mess. It's a dog's breakfast. But then if we are able to, you can see there's an FTP there, and if we looked at average power or something like that, it's not really going to give us as much information as something like zones. So if we overlay zones and power distributions, we can start to see like where this effort starts to look. So if you have, again, bike racing, it's just a mess. It's not a steady state. It's not an Ironman. It's not a half Ironman. It's not a time trial. There's surging, there's taking turns. And then we can see like, even it gives a good indication of pacing, because just eyeballing a 5-hour race on Training Peaks, especially if you're trying to do it on your phone, it's hard to pull out something. But you can see here, if you're looking at sort of the first quarter of the graph on the left, you can see it's dark purple. Okay, you don't even really need to know what the zones are. You just know that they get harder as it goes up.
Yeah.
And then over to the last quarter of the graph on the right hand side, it's a lot more light purple, Matt.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it looks like someone blew up here. Is this yours, Will?
It's my Zwift race.
What happened in the middle, actually? Were you like, I think I'm going to blow up, and then you started coasting?
Yeah, it was a descent. Yeah. And
oh, that came at a good time. I went way too hard.
Yeah, well, I still blew pretty hard. But you can see here, it's zones has been able to show us what kind of intensity I was riding at different points within the race. And then we can have a look time in zones, and we can also have a look at some of the distribution curve. So that's where zones are really valuable after the fact. And we can then go, okay, if this is what a race looks like, this is what your standard race, although probably, an improperly paced race looks like, we can start to try and incorporate that in towards our training. Like if we are spending time in zone 5 or 6 within our race, we should probably touch on that within training. And we can do that just by like a simple analysis to have a look. If we're doing an Ironman and there is like 0 time in zone 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it doesn't really matter that we aren't training in there. We can show an athlete that they need to, focus on what the bread and butter is, what the most important part is.
I would say, actually, if you're doing an Ironman and there is any time in zone 4, 5, 6, that maybe you're not doing it right.
Right? It should be an alert or something.
Yeah.
On
Warning. You still have to run a marathon.
Yeah.
So what do you take? What do you take from your file here? Right? Do you have any takeaways?
Yeah. Like I actually didn't realize the amount of time I spent in zone 6 and 7. Like it really feels like for a majority of the race, I was kind of like just above threshold, right? So like I was trying obviously in the start, the first kind of 40 minutes of the race, which the big climb was, I was like at and here's probably my threshold's 320 and I was riding at 370. So threshold being 60 minute, and I thought I could hold 370, 380 with surges for about 20 to 30 minutes, which is kind of possible. But the amount of surges within that, so it's not just that, like, I thought I was riding 360, 370, 380, somewhere in that range that I knew I could sustain for approximately 30 minutes. But then there was like the time in zone like 7 where you'd stretch to get back on the bunch, which is really, really hurting me. And just like clearly I blew up.
Yeah. I would say actually this is about as steady state as it gets. Yeah. So back to the whole suffering thing. When we're doing a field test and we're trying to set our FTP and set our zones, suffering is really hard. And I like to give as much leeway to the athlete as I can. So my pro tip is when we do a time trial, it should be around 20 minutes and use a set distance. And this makes it a lot easier mentally for the athletes to be able to complete it instead of pushing beyond the landmark that they finished last time just to get to that 20 minutes. So it's really nice for an athlete if they take a 20-minute test between 2 landmarks and are able to cut that down to 19 minutes. We're still able to average to get their power and to set their zones. And we know that they've improved and they know that they went faster. So I think it's a really great way to do it. It gives a little bit of leeway to the athletes.
Yeah, and I think especially cyclists forget that speed is still the most important metric in terms of who gets to the finish line first. And triathletes especially, that aerodynamics help because it allows you to go faster for less power. It's not all about who can push the most power, and it's a good representation of if you can get to the same landmark faster, you're going faster.
Yeah, exactly. But wind and environmental conditions definitely factor in. So that's why I still think power is really important. I know you're a bit of a power basher in a way.
No, I'm just saying you can't neglect speed.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what matters. And especially with developing athletes as their bodies start to change. So young athletes, as they get bigger, this is really important because they know they've gotten faster over the years and things like that. So the three main takeaways from this module is that training zones make it easier for us to talk between ourselves, between athletes, between coaches, coach to coach, software to coach, everything. So training zones make it simple for us. The other thing is that training zones aren't an exact science. We need some leeway in there, and being 1% over your zone isn't going to totally ruin your whole season. And one of the most important things for me is that there are so many ways that we can benchmark our fitness. Just pick one and stick with it. And stick with it and stick with it and stick with it, because we can test it over and over to see how the fitness has changed and see how training zones need to be changed as we go throughout a training program.
And if you'd like a practical application of how to use training zones with a bit of banter, check out episode 53 of the Performance Advantage podcast. Dr. Matt and I started the Performance Advantage podcast to help runners, riders, and outdoor competitors integrate sports science more effectively into their training and racing.
So over the last few years, Dr. Will and I have covered topics like the lactate threshold, training zones, power meters, and fatigue. Now we're condensing these popular and misunderstood topics into practical courses.
Our courses take our same podcasting style approach to learning and education, and we break it down into bite-sized chunks that you can digest either all at once or as practical little resources to use as and when you need them.
So the biggest difference between our course and any other course you might have taken is that we don't lecture you. It's a conversation between Will and I, and we're explaining complex sports science principles in an easy to understand manner.
Yeah, we also integrate how we use them on the regular. Our courses come with a certificate of completion, as well as a lot of takeaway resources such as training plans, scientific articles, and quizzes that you can do to check your progress along the way.
Our sports science courses are available now. Register on performanceadvantagepodcast.com for immediate access.